this rainy day for the completion of the series, we end with two thinkers who share the trait of suffering of ironic reputation. Ironic because they are both celebrated, each in his own way, but each of these figures is celebrated for an idea which he not only did not have, but which he specifically refuted, as we shall shortly see. Isaac Newton is widely reputed to be the scientist who had a complete, self-contained, mechanical view of the universe that didn't require any deity whatsoever. That is exactly what he did not have by his own explanation. And similarly, Jonathan Edwards is known as a fire and brimstone preacher who waved his arms a lot. In fact, he read from very carefully considered manuscripts, and he developed an understanding of faith in which it was precisely not subjective, but related directly to the reality of the universe. How is it we could have got these two figures so wrong that they are diametrically opposed to what they themselves argued? It's because each of them, in his own way, represents the same perspective of Aristotelianism that we have been discussing for the past couple of weeks, and they bring it to its apogee. After them, the Enlightenment moves in a different direction, with the result that the actual quality of their thought has been lost. So I would like to close our series with what I take to be the height of the Enlightenment, when faith and reason are not seen in the least as diametrically opposed, but rather they are understood to be functioning as methods of cognition that work together. And in order to make this plain, I have chosen the most theological of Isaac Newton's writings and the most scientific of Jonathan Edwards's writings, so that you can see this shared understanding of how it is that ultimate reality can be perceived within the universe as presently constructed. I begin with Isaac Newton in a work that appeared after his death, because he came very reluctantly to print. He would not have received tenure today. And 4 letters that he wrote to the Bishop of Gloucester came out in 1751, in which the Bishop of Gloucester, Bentley, had been reading Newton's principal work, the Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, in which Newton had worked out the structure of the solar system on the basis of a new mathematics which he had discovered called calculus. The Bishop of Gloucester read this work, front to back, and sent in a few questions and observations, and Newton therefore replied, and we can see one reason from the very beginning why Newton was happy to reply to Bentley. He said, "When I wrote my treatise about our system, I had an eye upon such principles that might work with considering men for the belief of a deity. And nothing can rejoice me more than to find it useful for that purpose." I thought it important to put those words there in Newton's own language so that you can understand that the Newton you learned in high school was not the Newton who looked at himself in the mirror. Then he replies to some of the questions. To your second query, Bentley, I answer that the motions which the planets now have could not spring from a natural cause alone, but were impressed by an intelligent agent. And it is language of intelligent agent which he uses time and again through this correspondence and elsewhere. What Newton clearly has in mind is that Aristotelian fourth cause, entelechia, purposive action, as being required for our understanding of the present configuration of the universe and also its ultimate goal. It's interesting that in the correspondence, Bentley is the one who presses Newton on this question: how much God, in effect, do you really need in order to keep the system, our solar system, going? So Bentley suggests to him, well, perhaps we could account for the movement of the planets without positing an intelligent agent. Maybe we can do it just speaking of gravity alone. Newton replies, so then, answering to your hypothesis, gravity may put the planets into motion, that is, might draw the planets towards the sun, let's say, but without the divine power, it could never put them into such a circulating motion as they have about the sun. And therefore, for this, as well as other reasons, I'm compelled to ascribe the frame of this system to an intelligent agent. You need to have centrifugal force as well as gravity and circular motion. And besides that, Newton, in just one moment of this correspondence, shows some annoyance with Bentley. That will be in the next entry. Obviously, Bentley is pressing this question about gravity and saying, can't we say that it is gravity alone? And so Newton says to him, you sometimes speak of gravity as essential and inherent to matter. Pray do not ascribe that notion to me. Whenever in his correspondence Newton says, pray, you know he's truly annoyed. Then he goes on to say, for the moment, for the cause of gravity is what I do not pretend to know, and therefore would take more time to consider it. But as he writes these words, he was actively considering it, and we'll find that he comes to a conclusion. And in doing so, returns to this conception of Bentley's and others. In fact, it is the very same conception that you'll find today among those who attribute to Newton the idea of a mechanical universe. They bypass the question of where gravity comes from by saying it's inherent to matter, which Newton believes is simply an inadequate response to the whole question. And so he writes to Bentley, it is inconceivable that inanimate brute matter should, without the mediation of something else which is not material, operate upon and affect other matter without mutual contact, as it must be if gravitation in the sense of Epicurus be essential and inherent in it. So he was reading Epicurean philosophy at the same time that he was pursuing his mathematical inquiries and various experiments in alchemy, and at the same time that he was writing up universal chronologies for the world. He was a man with spare time and an enormous amount of energy. And one of his purposes is to locate and, as necessary, differentiate himself from classical philosophy. He believed that anyone studying science at an advanced level should commence the university career by every morning translating from Greek to Latin and then different texts from Latin and Greek, and have them corrected on that same day by the tutor. And he felt that if you did this for a few months at the very beginning of your university course, you would then be in intellectual shape in order to pursue science. And while he's doing all this, he becomes aware of all the different conceptions that we've been referring to during the course of our discussion. He knows Epicurus, he knows Plato, he knows Aristotle, he knows Ibn Sina, he knows Ibn Rushd, he certainly knows John Calvin. He reads very deeply in the Puritan philosophy and theology of his time, especially as concerns the apocalypse, the revelation to John. So that results in his view that because gravity is a force, it should not be regarded as something which is simply derivative from matter. And since it is a force which also has a purpose, it must be the case that it is an intelligent agent. And he goes on to develop this thought in the last excerpt from these 4 letters on page 1. For if there be an innate gravity, it is impossible now for the matter of the earth and all the planets to stars to fly up from them and become evenly spread throughout all the heavens without a supernatural power. And certainly that which can never be hereafter without a supernatural power could never be heretofore without the same power. In other words, if I may express this inelegantly, if gravity does what you think it does, Dr. Bentley, if you think it really is inherent in matter, then everything would just be a giant clump. There would be a natural tendency for all of this to fuse together. And in fact, it is precisely because of that observation that those like Stephen Hawking have attempted to argue that what stops it happening is the Big Bang, a huge amount of energy which would propel the matter outwards. You need to bring in some other factor to account for this if you think that gravity is inherent. Newton, however, would disapprove of Hawking's maneuver. Why? Because you have to invent a Big Bang. And invent a Big Bang at the very beginning. And Newton states in the document I'm just coming to, his general scholium, hypotheses non fingo. I do not develop hypotheses. In other words, you can't bring in new factors that you simply imagine to be present in order to make your scheme work. And anything like the Big Bang, some source of energy to counteract gravity, would represent in his mind such a problem. This general scholium to which I refer is from the 1713 edition of his Principia Mathematica. Because everything is worked out in terms of the calculus that he himself developed, and by the way, in a notation that is today no longer used, it is and was extremely difficult to follow the argumentation. And as a result, in the general scholium, Newton provided what he took to be the framework for an understanding of what he was saying in the Principia Mathematica, and was also locating it within what he took to be the overall tendency of his thought. Because by the time he came to write the general scholium, he had made his transition. He had left Cambridge University, Trinity College, and he had moved on to London, where he became head of the Royal Mint. And as I was saying to students earlier today, made it his business to track down and punish people who clipped coins, who would strip the edges off of silver coins in order to hoard that precious metal. He thought hanging was the appropriate punishment, and he inflicted it on more than one occasion. Not a person to cross. He found the one profession in which he could be more cruel than a Trinity College professor. So within the general scholium, he moves out from his idea of gravitational attraction. Now, his principal contribution to learning, which stands quite apart from later Einsteinian relativity, quite apart from that, the part of Newton's contribution that stands is his proof that you can take the laws of acceleration by gravity that Galileo had demonstrated, and you could apply those same laws to the functioning of the universe. And the way that you could do that is by means of the calculus that permits you to trace velocity along a curved line. That's its very purpose in life. Having done that, Newton in the general scholium is about to go on and move beyond what he was able to demonstrate by his calculus. He's about to suggest that this principle of gravitational attraction works not only outside the atmosphere, but also internal to the human body. And so he writes, and now we might add something concerning a certain most subtle spirit. And this is where I took the inspiration for the title of today's remarks, because now Newton is making a correlation between the intelligent agent of gravity that he referred to and spirit understood as being bodiless. And this goes back to that observation of Ibn Sina, that any adequate understanding of God must be of divine bodilessness, that God is causative, but not embodied in the way that creatures are. So for Newton, this is conveyed by the conception of subtle spirit, which, he says, pervades and lies hid in all gross bodies. And by gross bodies, he doesn't mean ugly ones or obese ones. By gross bodies, he means bodies that may be perceived. Any body that may be perceived is pervaded by a subtle spirit that lies within it. By the force and action of which spirit the particles of bodies mutually attract one another at near distances and cohere if contiguous. That is, he notices that bodies may attract to such a degree that they can actually come together. But then this attraction is not only observable at relatively near distance. The whole reason his mathematics works is that it can take place over millions of miles. And part of the appeal of Newton's understanding is that it works bodies that lie that distance. And so he goes on to say, and electric bodies operate to greater distances, as well repelling as attracting the neighboring corpuscles. And light is emitted, reflected, refracted, inflected, and heats bodies. So now he's talking at this literally interstellar scale, and what he believes he can show by means of his calculus. And it's on the basis that gravitational attraction works at near distance and at very far distance. And notice he also brings into the question the issue of how light is emitted and how light is perceived. And he's talking about that because his other major treatise is entitled Optics. He wants to know why it is that we can perceive light at all. And he's especially interested in that question because one of the most seismic results of Newton's approach is to show that beyond the atmosphere, space is empty, that there is a vacuum in space. Prior to Newton, there had been a lively dispute over what kind of matter there must be out there. The ancients thought it was a primeval form of water. But Newton is able to show, because I can track the motion of a planet, let's say Mars, using my calculus, and my mathematics work, that shows there is no drag on Mars. That Mars must be going through nothing in order to be able to proceed in that way. The discovery of the vacuum of space, this is in the age before there's any dark matter, again, pre-Einsteinium, pre-quantum physics. Within that setting, there's a vacuum of space, and it raises the question, if space is a vacuum, what can possibly operate across a vacuum? That is Newton's reason for finding gravity is a most subtle spirit, something that attracts and that governs without requiring any medium whatever. It is not a mechanical operation at all. It is literally, in his mind, a spiritual operation. And having spoken of that at the scale of his observations of planetary motion, he goes on to speak of what happens inside the human body, because remember, he also wrote on optics. And all sensation is excited, and the members of animal bodies move at the command of the will. How does he mean that? You can decide to move your body. How does that happen? By his time, we know you have a nervous system. We know you have a circulatory system. We know you have muscles. But there is no mechanical operation that explains why my decision to move my hand moves my hand. There is a form of communication neurologically to muscles fed by circulation, which makes even the smallest movement possible, and yet that doesn't occur as, for example, it would occur in a steam engine. You're jumping from one system to another. Members of animal bodies move at the command of the will, namely by vibrations of this spirit. That is, the same spirit that governs gravitation, also at a lower level, at a microscopic level, permits you to move in the way that you do. Mutually propagated, yes, he spelled it wrong, mutually propagated along the solid filaments of the nerves, from the outward organs of sense to the brain, and from the brain to the muscles. Those things can only occur, he argues, because there is an intelligent agency that permits one kind of system to communicate with another kind of system. And that's the reason for which, in Newton's understanding of himself, he has elaborated a literally deist system. A system in which you need to understand God as a bodiless but intelligent cause who not only puts all in motion, but keeps all in motion. Otherwise, it would not be possible to maintain its existence. So Newton, the scientist, maintains his own standing in his mind as theologian. And the opposite is happening with Jonathan Edwards. Namely, the theologian is keeping his hand in science. And he does this from a very early age. From the time he's an adolescent, he becomes fascinated with spiders and the way that spiders are especially active at this time of year. And he looks at the ability of spiders to spin their webs and also to move from tree to tree in the forest, and comes to the conclusion spiders do this because they're equipped to do it, and spiders are doing this for the fun of it. And so he comes to the finding in the first excerpt from his essay, The Spider, 1723, hence the wisdom of the Creator in providing of the spider with that wonderful liquor from which their bottle tail is filled, that may so easily be drawn out, so exceeding fine, and being in this way exposed to the air, will so immediately convert to a dry substance that shall be so very rare as to be lighter than the air, and will so excellently serve to all their purposes. Hence, the exuberant goodness of the Creator, who hath not only provided for all the necessities, but also for the pleasure and recreation of all sorts of creatures, even the insects. So, as he understands it, there is something that endows a body such as a spider, not only with the provision of what permits the spider to exist, but also permits the spider to enjoy. As Edward sees it, there is some principle of enjoyment which is built in as part of the entelechia, the purpose of creation itself. And he also believes that this ties into what we would later think of as being the ecological purpose of the life cycle of the spider. Because he asks himself, why are all these spiders in the autumn following the winds so as to be pushed out to sea here in New England, which is where he was? And his conclusion is this is a part of renewal, because what's going on is that the spiders are being pushed out at the end of the planting season, so that when all the baby spiders are hatched in the springtime, we will not be knee-deep in spiders. And he also thinks that the function of this removal of the spiders is so that they take toxins out with them. And so he writes, so it must necessarily be that almost all aerial insects and spiders which live upon them and are made up of them are at the end of the year swept away into the sea and buried in the ocean, and leave nothing behind them but their eggs for the new stock the next year. So Jonathan Edwards begins to develop a proto-ecological understanding of how it is that animals in creation move through their life cycles for their own enjoyment and also for the service of the whole of creation. And this causes him to think about the nature of what it is to have a body. What is it that makes us similar to spiders? It's actually a serious thought for him. His famous sermon, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God, compares sinners to spiders. But in his mind, that's a compliment, because God cares about spiders. He wants them to have fun as well as to serve. He thinks no less of people. But what is it that makes a body a body? And here, Edwards makes a move which is also Aristotelian, but which takes him in a different direction from Newton. It's notable that he does this because we know that he read Newton. Newton was in his library. They overlapped in their lives. Newton had no awareness of Jonathan Edwards, but Edwards knew well about Newton's accomplishments, especially the vacuum of space. Because watch this vacuum and what it is about to do in the thought of Jonathan Edwards. He says, every body And every part of a body has length and breadth and thickness. That is to say that we are three-dimensional, and that space is something which is necessary as a condition for the existence of any kind of body of which we are aware. Any kind of body, visible or invisible, exists in space. This causes him, in a separate essay called On Being, written rather early in his career, to say space is this necessary, eternal, infinite, and omnipresent being. Why does he say space is a being? Because without space there can be no body whatsoever. Any kind of phenomenon of which we're aware requires space in which to take place, which means space is the potential of all phenomena at all times, which is why he refers to it as being both necessary and eternal. And omnipresent, because it must be in every place where a body will emerge. Despite the fact of being empty, as he has learned it is from Isaac Newton, Edwards attributes being to space and also explicitly argues, this made for a great deal of controversy in his time and later, he also argues that space is God. Where Isaac Newton had referred to intelligent agent as being God, the causative principle, Jonathan Edwards sees space, the necessary condition of life, as infinite being, and therefore also as God. And he believes that this is a necessary contradiction of those who try to argue that there is such a thing as nothing. One of the reasons for his essay on being is to say that being, the fact of existence, is actually our point of departure in all reflection. The idea of nothing is artificial. Nothing is something that we produce by subtracting from what we know. Nothing has no actual status within philosophy. He would just not have got along with the existentialists at all. Because he writes, a state of nothing is a state wherein every proposition of Euclid is not true. Now note, just as Newton reads Epicurus, Jonathan Edwards reads Euclid and says that geometrically it must be the case that space is generative of all phenomena, and therefore space is being and is God. To think otherwise would make every proposition in Euclid not true, nor any of those self-evident maxims by which they are demonstrated. And he goes on to say, it follows from hence that those beings which have knowledge and consciousness are the only proper and real and substantial beings. Why is he saying this? Because space is what generates beings, and therefore the most proper and real and substantial beings are those that are aware of themselves in space, inasmuch as the being of other things is only by these. From hence we may see the gross mistake of those who think material things the most substantial beings, and spirits more like a showdown, whereas spirits only are properly substance. By this he means that bodies in space that are aware of themselves in space are the most substantial of all beings. Because the whole realm of space is a generative spirit, becoming aware within it represents being within its highest form. Now, there are two corollaries of this that Edwards applies both at a theoretical level and also at a practical level. At a theoretical level, Jonathan Edwards believed that because space and being are synonymous, space, being, and God are all the same thing, therefore also it is possible to imagine space being of different shapes and different dimensions, depending on the total number and extent of phenomena inside space at a given time. The relatively modern idea in physics of space contracting and expanding is actually anticipated by Jonathan Edwards. And the other, that is the theoretical breakthrough that's involved in his particular approach. And then there's also the practical, which he applies to his own particular condition in a book he wrote in 1743 called Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England. You can tell he didn't have any publicity agent, whatever. In which he develops his other idea, which is that because space is where phenomena are generated, and because spirit represents awareness in space, it's possible for the total awareness of spirit scientifically to increase. And he believes that's what's happening during the Great Awakening in New England. That's the cause of these events. These are not subjective experiences. These are rather objective increases in the accessibility of spirit, and it means that the world is about to change. And so he writes, this is decades before the Revolutionary War, "'Tis not unlikely that this work of God's Spirit that is so extraordinary and wonderful is the dawning, or at least the prelude, of that glorious work of God so often foretold in Scripture, which in the progress and issue of it shall renew the world of mankind. If we consider how long since the things foretold, as what should precede this great event, have been accomplished, and how long this event has been expected by the Church of God, and thought to be nigh by the most eminent men of God in the Church, and withal consider what the state of things now is, and has been for a considerable time, in the Church of God and the world of mankind, we can't reasonably think otherwise than that the beginning of this great work of God must be near. And there are many things that make it probable this work will begin in America. Because, he argues, we can see concretely an increase of access to spirit. In this regard, Edwards and Newton shared a well-founded optimism. Each of them believed, because of their readings of the Apocalypse, that spirit was being unleashed in the world in a new way. Newton thought, there's a reason that I found the calculus and others before me did not. The intelligent cause of all things is becoming more focused. And Edwards believed that there's a reason why people are excited when they hear me speaking in my boring fashion, and that is that spirit now is more accessible than it has been before, with this idea of there being a united cognition that joins faith and reason, science and religion, there came the view that human progress was possible. It is, I think, not a coincidence that when we lost the idea of the unity of these kinds of cognition, which happened during the 19th century, we also began to lose the notion of humanity's capacity for progress. Perhaps this week, in particular, a renewal of some sense of progress would not be a bad idea. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm tempted to ask you if you could go over all that again. I don't know how this kind of outlook from Christians doesn't seem, at least in my limited knowledge, to be reflected in Jewish or Muslim or any other religion that we can know.
I think that you're part right and part wrong in saying that this outlook is not shared by Muslim and Jewish thinkers, because we're speaking of a phase in Christian philosophy where the issue is the adaptation of Aristotle. And so, in particular, Newton and Edwards are convinced to the point of axiom that God has to be viewed as being bodiless. This is not a typical way for Christianity prior to the influence of Aristotle to think of God. However, the work of Ibn Sina had introduced Christianity to this conception of God, and because it made sense within the Aristotelian perspective, both Newton and Edwards pick it up. But they were anticipated in this by another great Aristotelian, namely Maimonides. Maimonides also got into trouble for thinking of God in a bodiless way, and Maimonides got into trouble for using mathematics in order to understand the thoughts of God. So we do have examples of both Jewish and Muslim thinkers who are moving in this same direction. But what is unquestionably the case is that the application of Aristotle falls into suspicion wherever it is applied. So there was a serious attack on what Jonathan Edwards was doing on the ground that his notion of spirit didn't appear to be biblical. Newton has typically, and this is in the secondary literature until today, been described as a heretic. Why do they call Isaac Newton a heretic? Obviously, he was a patriot. He killed coin clippers, right? Well, what made him a heretic was that because Newton believed God bodiless, it made no sense to describe Jesus as being God, right? Because Jesus, by definition, is embodied. Isaac Newton was one of the world's first Unitarians because he believed that God, in the proper sense, only refers to the Creator. But that doesn't make him a heretic in my judgment, because I think the great majority of Christians living since the Enlightenment have not thought that Jesus is God in the same sense that the Creator is God. So I would suggest that Isaac Newton was simply ahead of his time in that regard. The one who continues to be controversial, and what I find very interesting is that many historians of religion have not understood how controversial Jonathan Edwards was, is Edwards's equation between God and space. That, to my mind, is an extraordinarily daring connection, which we have not seen since Plotinus, back in the 3rd century. So these thinkers are always pressing at the very edges, typically run into trouble, and they're almost never a matter of conventional theology, but they influence the conventional theology after their time. So, for example, the idea that Jesus is not God in exactly the same way the Creator is, in 1700 would have got me into serious trouble, even to suggest people thought this. Now it's a matter of common observation.
It seems, though, that in churches or people have the concept that Jesus is God, or he sits, I don't know.
Right, if he sits at the right hand of God, is he God in the same sense that that other God is God? See, this has been the question literally since the 3rd century of the Common Era. That is, if you say that Christ has been raised from the dead, this is the beginning of it, right? Christ raised from the dead is eternal always, logically. However, eternity is not of a nature as only to move forward. It must be that Christ always existed. So then we can think of Christ at the time of creation acting with God as creator. This is the concept that says, as in the Gospel according to John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Christ is that Word, is that creative capacity of God. So the idea of Christ being eternal going forward and going back, this becomes part and parcel of Christian theology from a very early stage. It's there certainly at the very end of the 1st century in the Gospel according to John. But in speaking of Christ as being God's Word, and therefore in a sense being God, when you say that Jesus is God in a sense, does that mean that he's God, or he's associated with God? About that, there was a deep dispute. And this brought about what's called the Arian Controversy. The Arian Controversy had nothing to do with white supremacy, let me assure you. It had to do with the bishop whose name was Arius, A-R-I-U-S, not the other spelling, who held that any reasonable reading of the New Testament would show you that when Jesus himself speaks, he speaks of himself as being subsidiary to God. And if that is the case, and if he is after all the servant of all servants, then it must be the case that when we associate Jesus with God, we don't mean to say that he is God in the same sense that the Creator is God. Formally, he lost the argument because the Creed of Nicaea, which says that Christ is, quote, being of one substance with the Father, asserts that there's one substance of the divine shared by Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So formally speaking, Arius lost. But you can formally lose and in fact gain the substance of an argument, because all of the language of Christ does suggest some secondary position in regard to God. And so finally, by the time of Isaac Newton, because he is constantly, as a matter of scientific principle, looking for what he calls singularity. I want to know how God puts and keeps all things in motion in all times. There has to be a single one clause. If I subdivide divinity, the result of that is going to undermine my approach from the very beginning. So for reasons of philosophical coherence, Isaac Newton can't agree with the 39 articles of the Church of England at that time, which uphold the Trinity. For that reason, although he was on many occasions offered the possibility of being ordained, he turns that down. He does not wish to serve the church that way, though he wishes to write on behalf of the church. This puts him in an unusual position because he's a fellow at Trinity College. Nice irony, isn't it? And as a fellow of Trinity College, you have two requirements in his time and until the end of the 19th century. One, you have to be celibate. This was not a problem to him at all. The other is you have to be ordained if you're a fellow. Even the professor of mathematics has to be ordained. To get around that, he actually needed royal permission to continue as Lukácsian professor of mathematics without being ordained. It was all his conscience about not being able to say, yes, I submit to the idea of the Trinity, because he would not submit to that. He thought it was a bad mistake. In fact, Isaac Newton ultimately will date when the clock started ticking on the apocalypse from the time the Trinity became official law in the Roman Empire. He thought it was a basic logical mistake that had to be corrected. But he saw that correction as a matter of faith and reason working together. But I am going to be around for a few minutes further, so please don't hesitate to come up and we can take the discussion further. Thank you for coming. I'm hoping that next semester in the spring, during Lent, we'll do a series on Christianity and revolution, and I hope we'll have a good time.